Hello and welcome back to my channel, my friends. My name is Logan Hart. I was recently honored to be featured in the End of Slavery Summit put together by Cory Endrulat. He had a ton of amazing guests on there, and in my interview, I dove into one of my very favorite topics, truth itself. Those of you who've been following me for a while know that I can talk to no end on this topic, and in my opinion, if something is not of truth, then it has no value at all. So it might be of value to come to a deeper understanding of what truth is and how we can come to know it ourselves. So this is that interview. I'm really happy with the way it turned out, and I hope you enjoy.
Hello and welcome. This is Cory Endrulat. Welcome to the End of Slavery Summit. I'm here with Logan Hart. He is a spiritual student and teacher, presenter, podcaster, musician, producer, voice actor, cryptocurrency enthusiast, and self-employed entrepreneur. Indeed, he has many projects. He covers in a range of topics concerning freedom, slavery, and everything in between and beyond. Because his website is thewizardfactory.com, he goes over so many different topics, everything from the occult, natural law, to spiritual concepts, and going beyond just the veils of ignorance or the things that we see in our daily lives, and trying to look deeper. What are the deeper meaning behind things? And today, I think we're going to be talking a lot about that. We're going to be talking about truth, the importance of truth. How do we share that with others? Why it's important to look at it? How do we find it? And everything in between. So thank you, Logan. I'm glad to be talking to you. You've been doing this work for many years.
Thanks, Cory. It's great to be here.
Yeah. So and you also have Heartfire Visions, right? Which is your production company, and you did for production for Mark Passio's Natural Law documentary. Is that correct?
Yeah, I did the music for that one. Heartfire is kind of a passion project that just has more my creative side, music, voices, graphic design, just all kinds of things like that.
Awesome. Yeah, you were sharing with me programs I didn't know just before this. Anyways, we're
Yeah.
going to delve into truth. So how about you define for us what is truth?
Well, yeah, that's the ultimate question, isn't it? Because there's kind of two ways you can look at that. When some people, they like to question the idea of truth, and they're like, well, what truth? And it's like you have to separate the idea of that there's some tangible truth that's like all encompassing that you're trying to point at when you speak about truth, rather than the idea, the concept of truth itself, which is everything. It's all that is real and nothing that is not. Um, so, yeah, my definition of truth would essentially be, of course, what is occurring, what has occurred, and that's what has materialized from the plane of potentiality into a singularity of event that is transpiring now, and the record through history that has happened. But it's also what will happen according to natural law. So it's like, if you touch the fire, you're going to burn your hand. That's truth too, even though it hasn't happened yet. According to natural law, that's what is empowering about natural law, because it, in a way, allows you to tell the future. The more deeply and intimately you understand natural law, the better you can predict outcomes based on inputs and, situations.
Hmm. So
So that would be
yeah.
my simplified definition for truth, as simple as I can get it.
Hmm. So you're saying like it's also something that can't be changed then, right? If you're saying there's a predetermined output, when you know that if you put your hand on the hot stove, there's going to be a result. So technically, it's a result that we can't really change, and that's why we have to understand it. Is that sort of like what you're saying?
Yeah, so when you're looking at past and present, it really can't be changed because it's already happened.
Hmm.
Once it's went from that infinite potentiality into singularity, it can't be changed. It's immutable. But the future is more unwritten. So it's then looking at, what are the laws in effect in a given situation, because like you could take that truth, you'll burn your hand if you touch the fire, but then you could add in a truth of, well, if you wear a protective glove, then you won't burn your hand. But you didn't change the first law, you just added a new variable, a new condition to that situation that changed the outcome. And that's really where the empowerment comes in. And this is also how I look at magic as a practice and how it's really indistinguishable from a science. It's just having that deeper understanding of natural law and how to get specific outcomes according to your will.
Hmm. Yeah, so you're mentioning natural law and law in relation to truth. So does law have a connection with truth?
Absolutely. Yeah. And so again, it's more to do with kind of the future outcomes. Everything that is happening and has happened is still according to law. It's just that those things have played out. The variables were what they were, all of the different factors. If there's free will beings involved, it gets a lot more complicated as opposed to just kind of like inanimate objects, weather and, if I drop a pin, it falls. Those are more simple ways of looking at it. And then the aspect of that future with natural law involved, um, there's definitely a connection there in terms of like causal factors. If this, then that. That's like the most simple way that I like to explain what natural law is just it's like an equation. If this happens, then this will be the outcome.
Hmm. Okay. And so you mentioned magic and, your theme is also the wizard factory. So how does that tie in then with truth? I know you mentioned a little bit about it, but like how do we define that? Because I know I play some video games and they use like arcane and I look at the word arcana and it means knowledge. And then isn't the
Mm.
word wise and wizard, which stands for knowledge as well? So is there a connection here?
Absolutely. That's why I'm saying I don't actually see really any difference between magic and science,
Hmm.
because magic is more just the science of the deeper and lesser known laws. Gravity is a common law everybody has a basic understanding of. The arcana is just digging into those lesser known, more obscure laws that can be discovered through, obviously study, but more importantly practice and experimentation, because again, it's just a science. And how do you progress science forward but just taking it to the laboratory that is this reality field and just seeing what kind of results you get.
Hmm. Okay, so truth
So
can
they're
be used.
inseparable essentially.
Yeah, so truth, it seems like we're learning from truth to learn what we want to do in the future and to, like you said, sort of make predictions. Um, is there any other importance in truth, and why should people speak that truth to others? How do they know that what they have is the truth? Should they always be improving on that, or is there ever like a set moment where you're like, I understand, I know the truth, and this is what it is, and it can't be anything else?
Oh, that's a great question. There's definitely different layers to that. So I would say, first of all, there are different hierarchies of truth. And so like the higher up you get to the pinnacle, the more profound and really universal those truths become. It's kind of, it's hard to even say truths because truth itself is singular. It is simply the all. It's
Hmm.
synonymous with the all. But because we're humans, we're having a limited subjective experience. We can kind of subdivide truth into more conceptualized and attainable aspects. Even though it's still all the one thing, it's more useful to break things into more specific things that we can actually put into, to just say everything is one and separateness is an illusion. It may be one of the highest truths there is, but it's only so practical. You know what I mean? Like if you're in a situation where maybe you're in danger and there's a bad actor involved and you're just like, oh, but it's fine, we're all one. That's not really going to help you in that situation, things
Hmm.
like that. So you do have to kind of like see it from that top down perspective and break it into more practical boots on the ground type of ideas. Let's see. There was more to your question. It was a very deep, kind of like loaded question. Can you repeat some of what were you were saying?
Yeah, so I'm saying like truth, and it you can tell like some people have different aspects, and they feel like, well, maybe I don't know all the truth, or is it still
Mm,
like a process of, well, maybe the truth is confined in this one box. Like people feel like, oh, I already have the truth, I don't need to know any more truth. Like, does that process of learning truth ever stop? Or like, because it seems like some people might
right.
want to say, oh, I know what it is.
Yeah. So again, the higher you go in that hierarchy, the more universal and constant those truths become. So you want to aim for those and get as close to that peak as you can, and of course, always be applying that to your life. But then even having a basic understanding of say something like the fundamentals of objective morality, the deepest core of natural law itself, because I see natural law, it's all laws in effect, including the physical, um, the uh, the spiritual, the moral, but then the ethics is at the most center because it's to deal with how we relate with each other sentient beings that all have our own free will. And to say my freedom ends where your freedom begins, that's like one of the most important truths, right? So you can understand that at a basic fundamental level, and that is one of the most important truths to come to understand. But even within that, I've been studying this stuff for years, and my understanding continues to deepen. Yeah, it's not like a one and done thing, like, "No, I get it, don't steal." I mean, that's simple enough, right? But,
Mhm.
you can continue to peel back layers of nuance, and to me, that's where the real magic is, because if you're only operating from a basic understanding of things, you're still gonna be kind of clunky and unrefined. So to answer your question directly, no, the search for truth never ends, because even when you find it, you're building a direct relationship with it that can always go deeper. It's like when you get married, you might be in love when you first get married, but after 30 years, that love is so much more rich and developed. And it's the same thing with truth, in my opinion.
Wow. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it seems like a practice all of life, right? Maybe
It's a
like one big,
lifestyle.
one big
Yes.
magical learning how to weave our spells and and what we're trying to
Yes.
put out there. So how do we find the truth? Would you say there's a particular method that people would use? Like someone would say, well, what about the scientific method? But you're saying magic is beyond science. So how do we find this?
Well, I don't think magic is beyond science. I
Mm,
I, I say it's synonymous with science,
okay.
and the scientific method is great. That's the front lines. You can acquire truth from all different places, but you don't know it's truth until you put it into practice. And that's why I say, if it's not useful, if it's not practical, then what value even is it? You know what
Mm,
I'm saying?
yeah.
Like, it's not going to enrich your life in any ways if you can't even actually use it. So, you know, I like to differentiate knowledge from truth and knowledge from belief, because um, if you believe something to be true and it's not true, it's not really knowledge. It's simply a belief, which is a false belief, right? But if you believe something that is true, it becomes knowledge, because knowledge is only that which is true. So that's how I see the connection of those three things. And so you can read something in a book, you can pick up wisdom from someone you have through a conversation or a dream, or I mean, there's infinite ways you can get ideas that you can form a belief around, but it's only until you can actually observe the validity of that belief that it transforms into knowledge, because then you have a firsthand gnosis of that as truth.
Mm. Yeah, I kind of want to now tie in some of the negative aspects to this and how it affects truth, sort of like the other side of truth. But before we get into that, how do people speak the truth? So now you went over how we find the truth. Well, how can people speak that truth to others? Is there any particular methods for that?
Well, of course, yeah, there's knowing truth is one thing, but being able to teach and communicate effectively is an entirely different skill set.
Mm,
And ultimately, it doesn't matter how right you are, if you
right.
can't convey that in a way that somebody can actually receive and truly understand for themselves, then it's not about truth at all. It's about you stroking your own ego and trying to use truth as a weapon just to elevate yourself above other people, as like some kind of superiority thing, right? Because if it's not ultimately your goal to actually help empower and liberate that person with truth, then there's no real value in it other than just kind of self-serving
Right.
your ego.
Like, why do you even have truth? Like, the whole point is to help us, right? To know it and practice it, like you
Right.
mentioned
And
before.
no one has a copyright on truth.
Mm, that's
Like, if
true.
I tell you the sun is gonna rise tomorrow, I can't put that in a book, and then next thing you know, somebody's saying the sun's gonna rise tomorrow, and I'm coming after you with, saying, "Well, that's my idea." That's not how it
Wow, you
works.
know the truth. I must obey you. I mean, you clearly are the representation of the truth.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's some, aspects of like, well, if you have a certain way of certain ideas or certain ways of conveying truth, you can take claim to that you found your own unique way of
Mhm.
presenting it, and that's different. But something as straightforward as the sun is going to rise,
Right,
there's no way to make that unique or personal. So there's
right.
some
You
kind
are
of
not the
gray area
truth.
there, but ultimately truth itself no one owns, and it's for everyone. It's self-evident, and it's for everyone's betterment, because like, I benefit from you understanding truth better as well, because truth and love are really, I see, as two, it's like the masculine and feminine aspects
Mm,
of the same thing. Like, truth brings love, love brings truth. They're different, but they're the same, kind of like masculine and feminine. And so the more truth exists, the more love, the more freedom. And per the law of freedom, the more knowledge people have of morality, the more free they become, and vice versa. The more ignorant we become as a collective, the more enslaved we will be. So everyone actually benefits from understanding truth. So why, the only reason anyone would keep it to themselves is because they want to control and keep themselves above, and this is exactly what the ruling class, the elites, the dark occultists, whatever you want to call them, the social engineers, this is exactly what they do. They
mm,
keep truth obscured, obfuscated and
right.
occulted, and keep it to themselves so they can essentially weaponize it and use it to manipulate people.
Right. Yeah, because it seems like we're looking at truth as a very positive force because we're bringing it to people, masses of people who potentially may not have that truth. Especially about what we're talking about with the summit and what slavery may still exist. It's like we're trying to prove something that is currently happening in effect already. So we're saying it is the truth, and we're doing it so from a philosophical standpoint where anybody in the world can understand it, right? Because truth would also be universal if it's something that is by law and natural law, as you mentioned. Is that correct?
Yeah, truth is universal.
Mm. So,
And
yeah.
I was just going to say, like with the summit, for example, there's all these different people that are involved. Different people have different ways of conveying truth.
Yeah.
Um, in slavery, is the theme, but we all have our own ways of kind of like looking at that, maybe different metaphors or allegories, or just kind of concepts that help it click, and different people have different um, mindsets, and
Right.
not only on the teacher's side, but then the listener's side. So somebody might totally not get what one guy's saying, and then another person, or girl, another person comes on and is talking about the same thing but says it in their own unique way, and then all of a sudden that light bulb goes off and they're like, oh, I get it now. So that's the beauty of more people coming out and speaking the truth, because we all have, even though truth is universal, we all have our own unique voices and ways of shining that light of truth.
Right. Yeah, great points. And it sort of reminds me, when you're saying, there's different ways to approach the truth. I think of other terms, like you mentioned love, and we were bringing other aspects. When I think of truth, and you said it's the all, it's another way of saying it. I think of nature as well. I say nature is the
Mm.
answer, and I think of honesty. I think of right, versus wrong. So, are these also correlate? Could we have different words for truth?
Yeah, well, even I would say love is another word for truth. Honesty, that's a great point, because the truth is so all encompassing that it shows up in different forms. But ultimately, if it is at all, then it is truth. If it simply is real.
Right. So what now? Let's break now. Let's go back under the layers and let's go see what is untruth, or maybe what is not truth. What would we call that, and how do we define it?
Yeah. So it would be like I false ideations, I see it as an abuse of the mind. The mind ultimately, its true purpose is a truth discovery tool, and as well as a means of controlling our body, which is how we create change and take action in the world, which is ultimately just how we apply truth via the trivium process. For it all begins with truth and our understanding of that as it's integrated into our being, and then we put that into action. But first and foremost, the mind is a truth discovery machine. And it's only when it becomes sick, when it becomes distorted, any deviation from truth is going to lead to sickness. This is a natural law in and of itself, whether that's physical, mental, emotional, spiritual, all of those layers. This rings true. So truth and nature, as you said, are also could be considered synonymous, because nature isn't just like trees and butterflies and things. It's um, it's the natural state of, it doesn't have to be earth even. It's just the natural state of things, without intervention, essentially. So if you just leave things as they are, like if you just stop, everybody moved out of a city, nature would take over. There's no one there to cut the grass and keep the animals out and etc. It just becomes like this, where all the natural laws are just playing out without man intervening. That's kind of how I see it.
Hmm.
So, say if you eat out of alignment with nature via not eating natural foods, but synthetic processed chemicals, bad food, you're going to breed disease because you deviated from truth. You deviated from nature. That's going to cause disease in the body. Well, the same thing is true of your mind. If you deviate from natural law and from the truth discovery process, it creates mental illness. And that's what, when someone's crazy or insane, that's literally what it is they've lost touch with reality, whether they're imagining things or they just, something's broken in terms of their empathy, and now they feel compelled to do harm to people. Like however that may show up, it's all just different forms of a distortion or deviation from truth. So that's essentially either the mind is working correctly, or it's according to its intended purpose, or it's deviating from that in some way.
Yeah.
Hope
Would
that all makes sense. That was kind of a
No, it's
long-winded
interesting how it's
explanation,
like
but
you're trying to share the truth of the not truth.
oh yeah, it gets pretty meta when you get into it. Like even to talk about nothing as if it's a something, even though it's nothing. It's like the number zero. It's something that has value because it's something you can talk about, but it is actually completely void of all meaning in and of itself, the thing
Right.
you're pointing to.
Hmm. Interesting. So, how do we tie in slavery with untruth? Would you say that human beings having the condition of slavery is not a truthful condition for them? How do we know that based on your definitions of truth and untruth?
Right, that's a great question as well, because it's easy for people to get confused between rights and abilities or possibilities.
Hmm.
So just because something can happen doesn't mean that's in alignment with truth. In other words, okay, it's true that it's occurring, but when it comes to higher truths, like we talked about earlier, understanding the higher truths, and this is why we're special as human beings, not to have hubris, but to simply understand we have a higher cognitive capacity than any other beings that we are aware of. We have the ability to reason with truth and have realizations about what is right and wrong. So, people say, well, natural law is BS because, you know, there's no law that's going to stop a bullet if I try to murder you with a gun. That's not how it works. Natural law doesn't say this can't happen. Natural law doesn't, it's not preventative, it's consequential. It's not that you can't do wrong or cause harm. It's that you can't do that without consequence. And the consequence, at the very least, is you've created harm, suffering, and slavery. It's literally unavoidable. You know what I'm saying? Like, you could just look at the state of the planet. We're living in it. Like, people always want some kind of where's the proof natural law is real? Look around you. Look at the insanity that we're living in because we've so deviated from true nature and higher, moral understanding and alignment.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, certainly, our body chemistry, I mean, we can look at the micro and the macro, right? Where we can learn from these laws or from different operating conditions, may you say. I mean, this
Mhm.
body has a certain way it functions, and you may say, there's a purpose for the heart, to pump blood. There's a purpose for the lungs to breathe. But some people will say, well, that doesn't have to be the purpose. And it's like, okay, then you're not going to be living. So it's like, do we
Mm.
have any do we need to prescribe value to certain things? Do we need to say that there is value inherent in nature? I would argue, yeah, we do. If we want to continue to live, if we want to have empathy, any sense of morality. Because it seems like when people say, well, you can't do that at all, it's like, well, then it's all up in the air. Who knows what's ever good and bad?
Right. Assigning value is everything. And that is to truly take responsibility for being a conscious being. The people That's what I think is people that are trying to negate that aspect and just say, "Oh, there's no good and evil. It's all just different experiences and different choices and all this." But that's this idea of discernment. Judgment is discernment plus value, assigning value, as in, yeah, these two are different, but this one's better, or this one's good and this one's bad. And of course, you can't think about everything like that. There is a balance to be had. Say it's raining one day and you say, "Oh, that's bad because I had plans." But then you end up, having this totally other experience that ended up good that you wouldn't have had otherwise. That's where it's kind of relativistic, but there's nothing relative about the fundamentals when we're talking about morality, good and evil, actual good and evil. So
Mm,
yeah, I mean, what I was saying is people that want to negate that aspect are shirking their responsibility for exercising conscience, for actually being uh, being responsible for assigning those values and saying what's good and what's bad.
mm,
Because maybe you're wrong sometimes. Yeah, but if you say there is no good and evil, then you're wrong all the time.
yeah.
That's much worse. It's much better to do the best you can than to just pretend like, "Oh, well, I'm not responsible for all that. I'm this woke observer that just sits and meditates and all is one and et cetera, et cetera." It's bullshit.
Mm.
You're basically being a spiritual infant, in my opinion. That's how I would say that.
Yeah, there's a quote from Frederick Douglass that I share with a lot of people where he talks about morality. And again, this is from somebody who was a slave himself, and he's looking at it and saying, well, wait, I breathe for me, you breathe for you. Like, I only my functions belong with me, your functions belong with you. You can claim to function for me, but you just don't in reality, in truth. So it's
and
like
truth.
the morality that you're talking about is not just morality that it's like preference or opinion. You're basing it on something that you cannot change.
Right, right. Exactly. It's kinda like thinking that you're voting to delegate your responsibilities away to some representative. That is an illusion. You're voting, you're doing a thing, but the function that you think it's having is actually not. You're never not responsible for you. So just to say, "Well, I voted for this guy and he didn't do what he said he was gonna do and blah, blah, blah." Guess what? You're still responsible for that outcome. That's
Yeah.
what we're talking about, the truth, the reality of that did not change just because you think that you delegated that right.
Mm. And I feel like people have a responsibility to truth itself if they're living in the world of lies. Would you agree with that?
Regardless, they have a responsibility to
Yeah.
truth because to be here,
Yeah. Good
incarnated
point.
in human form, you have great power. Despite what you think or don't think about it is irrelevant. Simply existing in the world has a huge effect on the world around you, the other people, the natural environment that you're in. And so every choice you make, you're responsible for. So if you don't care about truth, chances are you're being a really irresponsible and destructive and ignorant person and force in the world.
Mm.
So the only way to counter that is to actually develop, first of all, recognize that that is the case, and then develop a deep reverence for truth itself because you understand that without that, um, you know, well, you're responsible regardless. And so the best thing that you can possibly do is strive for deeper truth and integrating that truth, being in alignment with it as much as humanly possible. Are you going to make mistakes? Absolutely, we all are. To be a good person doesn't mean you have to be perfect. That's kind of some of that Abrahamic mindset programming running still, is
Yeah.
that you don't have to apologize or beg for forgiveness just because you make mistakes. But just because you think you're saved also doesn't exonerate you from your responsibility either. And that's another big pitfall of the religions, in my opinion. That's why personally I'm pretty anti-Abrahamic religions because it cultivates that kind of mindset that it's not about your good deeds, it's about your faith and obedience, which has no real value whatsoever. And it's anything but spiritual,
Mm.
actually.
Unless maybe you're obedient to truth, would you say itself?
Yeah, but I don't really
You're not obedient.
I wouldn't call it
Right.
obedience, right. It's like I'm not because I eat healthy, I'm not being obedient to, like, a diet. I'm acting out of self-love
Right.
because I know
Just
the
comes
laws
natural.
and the outcomes, and I want to just, make the best choices for myself. Obedience is usually in a context of reward and punishment.
Right.
And I mean, I guess that's one way to look at natural law. But personally, I think that's a very like shallow, surface level way of looking at it. It's not just about, well, I don't want to do bad things because bad karma. I want to avoid bad karma. Right? That's
Hmm.
not really an authentic reason to be a good person. Just because you don't want the bad backlash.
Right.
It's more about um, cultivating love. This is why I say truth and love are inseparable. Because when you truly love yourself, and that extends out towards other people, because you see that other people are you, and that extension of self love is the same as loving others. Um, then you naturally just you want to enrich the world in everything that you have influence on.
Yeah. Seems like a very holistic worldview. I think it's fantastic. When we're talking about truth and, you're mentioning some of these things like religion, and you mentioned before how we're giving our responsibilities away through these processes of voting and politics. Are there particular things that are holding us from our truth discovery process that you would say you would have to point out that you haven't necessarily pointed out yet? Are there things that you would have to say, this is what's stopping us from the truth, and more people, if they want the truth, should be looking at?
Hmm. Wow. Yeah, that's definitely a very deep question. to which there's a lot of answers, but I think the main thing that comes to mind with this is um, dealing with our own bullshit, because even at the level of government and voting, and yes, those are very real problems, but we have to take it back to first principles, and the very first hermetic law is mentalism, and second to correspondence. So everything that manifests is only corresponding to that first principle of what's happening in our mentations. So we can point at the government, and yes, it's very real and very negative objectively in its effects. We have exactly the government we deserve as a collective based on our internal state, our willingness to look at truth, to take personal responsibility for and face the fear of freedom, not only for ourselves but allowing other people to be free too, because I think that's the one thing that holds back, is like, well, sure, I'm a good person, but there's bad people out there and they shouldn't be free,
Mm.
you know.
Yeah.
It's just very hypocritical, but I digress. What I'm getting at is it's important to look at those problems that are happening externally, but it really all comes back to the main thing, which is looking inwards and transmuting the darkness within yourself, because you can only even take in or see, much less accept, truths that are correspondent to your own level of healing. If you're still operating from a wounded viewpoint, you're going to project that on other people. And this is exactly how government gets justified. They, people are basically projecting their own self loathing on humanity as a whole in like this misanthropic worldview altogether.
Okay. Yeah, I feel
So
like
that would be the
there's.
number one thing that's holding us back from truth, is just our ability to even see and recognize it
Mm,
through our own projections and fears and bullshit.
yeah, fear, ignorance, confusion, all that.
Mhm.
Yeah, everything that comes from fear. And that's, you can say, the opposite of love, what you mentioned before, which is synonymous with truth.
Mhm.
So, now bringing this in now with more with what we're talking about, you're talking about truth, we're talking about honesty, we're talking about nature, we're talking about the all, and then we're talking about these forces that could potentially disrupt that, and then our relationship with the truth. And we're looking at this as like, are we really in a healthy relationship, may you say, or a relationship where we're looking at ourselves, we're looking at the world holistically, because you're looking at many different factors. um, Yourself, you had to come to understand a lot of this, and maybe you went through some different aspects of this. How did you break out of the mentalities of following governments and religions? I mean, did you have to go through this truth discovery process that you're talking about?
Of course, and I think really what's important is that to understand, not only for yourself but other people who may have already woken up and they're getting impatient with other people, is that it happens in layers, and every person has their own pace at which they're able to integrate and recognize these things. It definitely wasn't that I was just a total sheep and then I watched one YouTube video and suddenly I was woke as hell and an anarchist and all this kind of stuff. I went
Right.
through many phases. I'd say my first, I mean, I can go into a little bit about that journey
Sure.
if you want. So just briefly, I was raised conservative Christian, so just very narrow view, conservative politically, and then Christian spiritually. Um, and the first wave was kind of like scientism, what I would say, which science, is very real and very valid and useful. Um, but I did kind of swing full pendulum to a bit of a materialist, atheist. I rejected, all spirituality because it was like the knee jerk reaction to, well, I knew there was something really wrong with what I was taught. So I just, it's very, typical human nature to kind of overcompensate and just like, well, if this is bad, then I want as far from that as I possibly can. And so eventually I kind of tempered that out with more of the new age ideas. So it's like I left religion to go, and it's almost like a blank slate of just like nihilism, materialism, atheism. And then through certain things like spirit science, I know it's almost cringy at this point, but again, this is the baby steps, and some use of psychedelics, DMT, psilocybin. These things really opened my mind more to, okay, well, there's definitely more than just the mechanical universe and physical laws. Like there is something metaphysical and spiritual happening.
Mm,
But I definitely fell into a lot of the new age traps as well.
I see.
And from there, that's when I guess you could say I red pilled as far as conspiracy stuff, and then I went full blown, doom and gloom. Everything's poison. They're just trying to kill us, and you see, patterns and conspiracies and everything, to the point it like, you know, it steals your joy. You can get kind of obsessive with it, and so I went through that phase, and but that led me down a road of first hearing about the occult, but from a very negative perspective. And I think this is pretty common, that you're like, okay, well, the world's run by a bunch of psychopaths, and they're all like these dark occultist Satanist people, and they have the all-seeing eye and the owl, and it's all evil, right? And but then I started kind of being exposed to like Jordan Maxwell, and diving into more of the actual symbolism, and seeing the light and the dark side. And then, of course, when I got into Mark Passio, that was the first time I'd ever even been exposed to the idea of what anarchy actually is, what the true meaning of it is, and what the occult is. Simply means hidden, and that it's neither good nor evil. It's all in how it's used. And so that's where I really kind of balanced out, I think, all of those different paths that I'd traveled to get to that point where I understood, I'm at a point where I'm open to spiritual things. I know the world's, very dark, and there's people controlling and subjugating people, but that's not the end of the road. And the more you go into occult knowledge of freedom, that's where the true empowerment comes in, because then you're like, well, de facto we live in a state of slavery, but slavery begins in the mind. And once you free yourself of that and understand your true value, and that you are a free and sovereign being, you're kind of not a slave anymore. Even though you may be still wearing the invisible handcuffs, you don't believe in your own enslavement anymore. And that's where most people still are. It's not just about the slavery system that exists, is that people actually believe that they're slaves and think that it's legitimate. And so all that to, that's where it all kind of converges, I guess.
Yeah, beautiful, man. Wow, what a journey. I think there's a lot of people out there who could potentially relate to you on that. They go through these systems, and we're sort of born into it. I mean, we're left versus right, or this ideology, that ideology, and then we progress, and then some people will straight up just be like, "Oh, it's all a lie. I guess I should be atheist now." And they don't see that there's other options or a bigger worldview and other knowledge out there. And I think maybe, as teachers, it is our role to bring that to them and say, no, that's not, there's still a light at the end of the tunnel. There's still other, lights to be found. And I think that's what you're doing so great with the Wizard Factory. You've interviewed so many great people. I mean, honestly, you've done a lot more than me when it comes to interviews and content over the years. So I give you credit to that. I want to say thank you for that, first of all.
Thank you.
And when it comes to that too, like bringing in independent media and your experience over these years, do you have any criticisms of independent media or what other content creators are doing when it comes to their pursuit of the truth? Now, I know we're not them, and we can do our best in our own regards if we see something needs to be done. But when it comes to truth discovery, and we're talking about truth, do you have any criticism of people when it comes to their portrayal of the truth, if they're not showing all the truth, if they're putting truth under certain labels or under certain ideologies? What would you have to say about any of that?
Well, first of all, I have to It's complicated because personally, I think that it's very, very important to take in truth, knowledge, whatever, because it's, it's only truth or knowledge if it's true, like we talked about earlier. But taking in information, different ideas, different perspectives and viewpoints from as many sources as you possibly can. So,
Mhm.
first of all, if you're only following one person and just taking anything that they say as truth, that's a big mistake. So but I know that not everyone follows that model. Unfortunately, they do kind of get caught up in the cult of personalities and kind of the follower leader dynamic, which there's nothing wrong with necessarily being a follower. It just depends. But what I'm saying is, if you're keeping that holistic approach to taking in information, then it's not so bad because you can hear this one person. He may have some really good ideas. He's off on this or that, or he goes a little too hard on this thing, or he thinks that Trump is the answer or whatever. You can kind of dismiss that. You don't put so much weight on it just because it's coming from this one person, and you can kind of temper and moderate that with all these other people that you listen to. So I think that's first and foremost, is regardless of what the creators or the speakers are doing, as a consumer, as I am as well. I'm a creator, but I listen to lots of people and take in ideas that way. So it's important to just diversify who you listen to and kind of cross it. It's like a buffet. Take what's useful and leave the rest.
Right.
Um, but no, I mean, I do think some people get a little too obsessive on certain things, or, uh, like say they're really into flat Earth or something like that. Yeah, I mean, that's just one example, but it's the low hanging fruit. It's so hard to not pick
Right.
on the flat earthers. Sorry. um, but I think it's a lot easier to identify the problems than it is to prescribe solutions. So that's where, again, take that with a grain of salt. Um, you can take in a lot of information and get a really clear picture on what the problem is, but don't put too much emphasis on whatever one solution is being presented by someone. Keep your mind open in terms of that. Like, oh well, maybe, like, keep your mind open. Don't reject it, but also don't think, no. He says he's got the problem so lined out, so his solution must be right. That's a fallacy. You know, you just kind of like, okay, take note of it.
Yeah. Do you think there needs to be a bit more priorities within independent media in general and content creators? Like, you and I, we understand a lot about the system and how, we may have to understand sovereignty, and we need to teach people like, hey, take charge of your life, when in reality they have to be the one to teach themselves. But we can provide them with guidance and tools to do so and introduce new ideas. Do you think that needs to be the priority in independent media, like over talking about news and what's current events? Because that doesn't deal with truth, right? Because you're talking about truth being something that's always here or has happened, and news can be based on truth, but it can be a symptom of truth. But is it really the truth? I mean, is this something we should spend, like, should we spend years talking about 9/11? It's an important event. It's not that we should ignore it, but should we be
Right.
talking about it forever? you know?
Yeah. And yeah, that's a great point because, again, I think it all comes back to the individual.
Hmm.
So, like you said, it's not that those things don't matter. It's good to be informed of like what is happening in the world, but especially if there's nothing you can do about it, or I mean, not just in terms of like changing that event, but also what actual benefit that knowing about that event is going to have directly on your life, then it's probably not fruitful to spend a whole lot of time obsessing about that or picking apart every single anomaly about some school shooting or something like that. I mean, like, if that's your passion, there's nothing wrong with that necessarily. Like, I'm glad people exist in the world that are going to
Right.
like go that deep on things, but for the most part, I don't personally spend that much time on that because it's not as useful as, say, learning skills or
Mm.
learning more about healing or breath practices or things like that that I can actually apply to my life that makes my life better. So, that's the best way, as small as that sounds, to actually enact change for the better in the world, is just to continue to get better as an individual.
Yeah.
And I think that that should be the message, the main message that people are focusing on. I do think people get too dialed in on external factors, whether it's just the government itself being the problem from the anarchist perspective, which it definitely is a problem, not diminishing that at all, or the pedophiles or the this or the that. It's like those things are out there and they have relevance, but if that's all you're focusing on and you never talk about doing shadow work or encouraging people to find peaceful ways to exit the system and grow their own food and heal themselves and take plant medicines and things like that, that's what I think should be actually put as a higher priority than knowing all of the horrible things that are happening in the world.
Mm. Yeah, great point. And it's like there's a question. Then it goes back to responsibility. What you mentioned before: do people really want to be responsible about it, or would they rather talk about these other things
That
so they can? Right.
they have no control over. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. You have control over yourself. So make that your main focus.
Beautiful. Yeah. So, you're talking about, we were talking about religions and governments and such too. I mean, what I think about when you're mentioning this is there's so many ideologies, there's so many different types of government, and everybody's like, oh, well, this will work here and this will work there. And then people are saying, well, the Bible has the truth and this book has the truth. And, I actually think this religion has all the truth in it. Are we to put all our truth in one thing? I mean, you said that when we look at people, we have to discern, and it's sort of like a buffet. We have to pick a little bit from
Mhm.
there and there and there. So would the same apply to ideologies and books and such?
1000%. Absolutely. Yes. And that's what I actually love about paganism, and why I consider, I identify as pagan. It's I don't see it as a religion. It's actually antithetical to religion because it is not dogmatic, and you can incorporate different cultures and practices into your belief system or your practice, like different ways of doing ritual or celebrating cycles of nature via holy days.
Mm.
Like this is where this stuff all comes from. And religion, one of the hallmarks is being like a cult that you're 100% this and you live by this thing, or else you're not a real that. Paganism is the exact opposite of that. It's, first of all, it's all based on nature, which we said no one has a copyright on. They don't care. Like, why do I care? Like how you choose to connect with nature or what name you want to call the thunder god or whatever. Like, does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah, you're taking it again from like a very open-minded point of view where you're like it's not one thing or another, but as long
It
as you
doesn't
can,
have to be
yes,
like that.
the
It's not
context.
rigid or like trying to force you into a box.
Mm.
It's about what resonates with you and what enriches your human experience and what you can use to make yourself better in whatever capacity.
Yeah. So you wouldn't go to someone and say paganism is the truth, would you?
No, well, I mean, you can't because it's not a thing.
Right.
It's the not thing. I mean, that's what I'm saying. It's kind of like the anarchy of religion. It's freedom
Right.
without imposing, no, Republican is the only way or socialism is the only way. Those are trying to, it's the same kind of concept of like, this is the truth and everybody, if you don't get that, then you're just wrong. You know, Anarchy is like, hey, if you like this, then go do that. And if you like that, then go do that. Paganism is literally just that same mindset applied to spirituality.
Hmm. Yeah, I sort of have that mindset for deism, because it just means godism. But I know that, yeah, that's true. I mean, that your paganism probably involves a lot more, and it seems like a lot of your themes too, and your channel, you talk a lot about ancestral, ties and and some of the occult with that. So some people might ask the question and say, well, didn't our ancestors do crazy bad things, and weren't they the slaveholders who were, killing and murdering and doing all this crazy stuff? So why would you support their practices? And what would you have to say to those people?
Great question. Just like with anything, there's so much nuance, and to say something like that is such a clunky, one-dimensional way of looking at things. Again, you have to be able to separate ideas from people. First of all, like Mark talks about Thelema versus Crowley.
Mm,
Like you just because Crowley didn't walk the walk doesn't mean the ideas of Thelema are somehow invalidated by his mistakes. It's the same kind of thing. I'm just saying I was just watching that, so it's fresh in my mind. But
right.
um, first of all, history has highly bastardized antiquity and our ancestral lineage, because that was an effect of the domination of the Abrahamic religions that
Mm,
wanted to paint. I mean, the very word like pagan really came almost as a derogatory term for anyone that wasn't Christian. I think that's a beautiful thing, but they meant it as something negative, because it was all about assimilating. And so they wanted to slander and make things look worse than they were. So I'm not saying that there weren't uh, atrocities committed and barbaric things, but I think they were a lot more peaceful, first of all, before Christianity came along. And a lot of that Viking, which is actually a verb meaning to go out and conquer and loot and things like that, uh, behavior came about as a traumatic outlet. It was a result of being subjugated and traumatized by the sword of Christianity, and to the point where I'm not excusing the behavior, but it will drive people to madness and extreme violence because they feel like there's no other way, kind of. So I'm certainly not excusing it, but I just think in general, the concept of pagans and ancient people is highly twisted, and they were a lot more peaceful in general than we're taught to believe. And then, yes, there were still atrocities committed, but that's human beings. We've never been perfect. There's always going to be bad people, and we'll find all different kinds of ways to justify that. But again, that doesn't negate the ideas themselves. And I will finish by saying, by all means, not just the Germanic people, but many uh, ancient pagan cultures deeply, deeply understood natural law, morality, those deep esoteric truths. And just because they were primitive, because they didn't have iPhones, they were probably more spiritually sophisticated in general, the common person, than 99% of people now, you know.
mm. Yeah, I mean, we could only wonder the people that were here in America originally, right? Before the colonizers went overseas, apparently, and did what? I mean, this is on the history record. I mean, we see there's nation states that will conquer areas of free people, and these people didn't have governments, and they were living on their own. But it seems like they
Mm,
had to subject themselves to these governments, and there were casualties on both sides because these people were defending their land, which rightfully so. I mean, they were just living their life. And then here's these people coming in saying, I get to rule this land. I put the flag on here. This means I rule this
mm.
territory. Seems kind of absurd. But people have let that happen. And the people who let that happen are what? The order followers, these people who turned off their brains, stopped thinking about what is the truth. Was truth ever even something they considered? you know?
Well, yeah, I mean, they think that their actions are justified by truth. The only problem is it wasn't truth. It was a belief, like we talked about earlier,
Mm,
because no belief that would uh, encourage or justify you initiating violence against someone else could ever be true, because it's antithetical to truth.
right. Yeah, it's again like violating that idea of like, yeah, I breathe for me, you breathe for you. It's like we respect that because that is who we are, and to violate that would be essentially to violate nature. It's like I can decide for you and be God and say, well, I dictate this is what should happen to you. It's like, well, who gave you that right? Who
Yeah.
gave you that ability? It's like, just because you can do it, might does not make it. Does might make right? I mean, you know.
Yeah, well, it's to me the height of performative hypocrisy is how I look at it,
Hmm.
because you're basically saying, um, I I will not afford the same respect to you that I would want for myself. This is the true meaning of the golden rule. I recently just did a video on this. It's not to say everyone wants to be treated exactly the same, but no one can possibly want their consent to be violated. And so you're basically being a hypocrite by saying, "Oh, I don't want my consent violated, but I'll violate your consent."
Hmm.
You're not a you're being inconsistent with your application.
Right.
It's a
Saying
fallacy through action.
like truth applies to me. It's for me only. I get to decide what to do with the truth. I can keep this truth away from you, and I can use it against you. It's like,
Right. That's the epitome of relativism and essentially having a god complex of
hmm,
just truth is whatever I say it is based on my whims and whatever situation I think, serves me best.
right. And then, because they have that hidden truth, they can twist it into whatever they want and say, and repackage it and say, well, this is the truth. And then people
Right.
take it in because they don't see another source of truth or anything beyond that. And that maybe has some aspects of truth, so it becomes a little bit more deceiving. It's like that quote says, if you mix lies with truth, it becomes more deceiving.
Yeah, sure. It's the cheese in the rat trap.
Hmm.
That's how
Right.
you get people, lured in.
Wow. Well, thank you, Logan, so much for this conversation. We hit about the hour mark, and we talked so much about truth. I mean, we really broke it down from so many different perspectives, and I encourage people to check out your videos. You said you did one on the golden rule. You also did a
Mhm.
video summary on natural law. So for people who haven't heard of these concepts, would recommend they check it out. And like I've also said, you also have done many interviews on every single subject. So thank you so much for what you do, man, and I appreciate you being here. Is there anything else you want to say? before-
Corey, it's been a pleasure. Thanks so much for having me. I hope everyone, enjoyed this conversation, and if you did resonate, do come, check out my channel as well and see some of the other topics that I've covered. But no, this was a really fun conversation, and thanks so much for having me.
But thank you guys for watching. If you want to see any more speakers like this and a ton more resources, totally free, we got over 50 speakers or so. You can go to nita.one/summit or endofslavery.org. This is the End of Slavery Summit. Thank you very much for watching. Take care, everybody. TheWizardFactory.com, The Wizard Factory and Heartfire Visions. Check him out, Logan Hart.